If you wake up in the middle of a pandemic and you discover that in the richest, most powerful country on earth, you're heavily dependent on a single country that, not incidentally, we're having a trade war with for things like basic materials for medicines, for personal protective gear like face masks and medical gowns, that's a pretty sobering experience. And there's certainly a push to think about place in a way in which we haven't for decades.
Goodman, the global economic correspondent for the New York Times and author of the new book, How the World Ran Out of Everything Inside the Global Supply Chain, joins us today. Thank you, Peter, for being here today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I don't think people understand just how massive the actual global supply chain is. In your book, you tell the story of a small Mississippi company that makes plastic ice cubes that, when dropped in water, glow. And the company, of course, is called Glow. Can you kind of elaborate on this story and just how it shows just how complex and massive the global supply chain really is?
Yeah, you bet. So, first of all, it's an incredibly important point. People throw fancy words around like supply chain, and it sounds like a bunch of wizards went up to a mountain and meditated on how to design a system to make stuff and move it around the globe. And what we've really got is a bunch of overlapping networks that are very improvised. There's a lot of shareholder interest. There's monopoly power. And even the insiders find that things are so complicated, nobody's entirely sure how it works. Not unlike discovering that finance, after the global financial crisis, was beyond not only the regulators' understanding, but even the insiders. But I digress. So Hagen Walker is this guy who graduated from Mississippi State, Starkville, Mississippi, launches the startup companies making these novelty cubes that, yes, they light up when you drop them in a drink. He's selling them to bartenders who like that they can put them in a cocktail. They can look down the bar. They can see who needs a refill just by seeing whose light went out. And then it turns out autistic children for whom bath time can be really traumatic are transfixed by these cubes dropped in water. So Hagen Walker develops a bath toy business. And right before I met him, he had gotten a deal with Sesame Street to make these Elmo-themed light-up bath toys, most important order in the history of a startup company. And he discovers, like most people with such ideas in the United States, that even though lots of people want to make things in the United States, it's incredibly difficult. He calls around to see if some local factory can handle this job. He figures out that the molds for this product would cost 12 times as much in the United States as they would in China. He looks into packaging at one point. He's got this idea for like a children's pop-up book style package. And he calls a bunch of factories. And one guy actually says, this is too complicated. Just get this made in China. So I use Hagen Walker as a way to follow one container, his first ever shipment large enough to fit in a 40-foot container, from the factory that made his stuff in Ningbo, China, across the Pacific, through this giant floating traffic jam in Southern California, and across the continent to Mississippi.
Since we're talking about the massive global supply chain, and you used the word kind of complex, but I found this quote from your book interesting. You say that, quote, Apple purchased parts from suppliers in 43 different countries across 6 continents while fitting them together into finished products at factories in China and Taiwan. Even seemingly simple products like disposable diapers require more than 50 materials. And then I was researching like the iPhone and how much would it cost for the iPhone to be built in the US? And the numbers were, I saw upwards of over $100,000 per unit. But the answer was basically they couldn't build the iPhone in the US. Like China started out as the world factory, was in the 1980s, whatever, and it was low cost. But then it became to the point where it's like, hey, China's building the iPhone 1, and they're building the iPhone 2, the iPhone 3, etc. And they had to advance. So they all of a sudden, instead of being the cheap labor factory of the world, it became advanced manufacturing. And I thought one of the themes of your book was we probably need to maybe decouple ourselves from China and 100% reliance. You mentioned on the book about how Walmart, if you went to Benton, Arkansas and had a meeting, with the
Bentonville,
Bentonville, with HQ and of Walmart, if you were having a factory that didn't operate in China before the pandemic, they wouldn't even see you. Like, okay, yeah, just leave. And now if you don't have a factory that's, you need to have multiple factories, right? That's what the pandemic taught us. And like one of the themes of the book that I thought was like, we want to kind of get away from China and have some more resiliency and have some other options, some diversity in the supply chain and the manufacturing, but it's really hard to do. Even a simple example, like you mentioned with Walker and his company in Mississippi called Glow.
Right. I mean, for smaller companies, it's very, very difficult to avoid China. I mean, Hagen Walker, having gone through the stuff I describe in the book, shortages of materials in China, zero COVID restrictions, worker shortages at the factory making his stuff, then this crisis of shipping. I mean, there's basically three giant alliances that dominate shipping traffic across the Pacific, and the cost of moving his container had gone from like $2,000 right before the pandemic to eventually $28,000 to move that same box just a few months later. So after all this, and then, worries about the rail system in the U.S., which has been really diminished by so-called precision scheduled railroading, which is a fancy way of saying let's fire lots of people and stick the people who are left over with more jobs. Real reliability crisis, so-called shortage of truck drivers, which is really running out of people willing to sign off on the very difficult life of being a truck driver. It's always been a tough job, but it pays a lot less nowadays. Well, so Hagen Walker looks at all this and says, maybe I should not rely entirely on China. He thinks about moving some of his production to Vietnam. He thinks about Cambodia. And in the end, he discovers that it's really hard to break up with China. There's just an unbeatable combination of efficiency, low wages, pretty good infrastructure. And he showed me this app on his phone, Alibaba, which is like China's answer to Amazon. It's in some ways, it's much more important than Amazon in China. And he said, look, if I need some component, if I need some electronic component, I can put out a proposal and I'll get like 15 bids in 20 minutes from factories around China. I'll end up on this page that looks like an Amazon page where I can see the reviews of these factories from other people who've hired them. I can then chat with these guys 24/7 in English, and I can do business just very quickly. He said, if I tried to build a supplier base like that in Vietnam, it would take me years. So he decided as a small player, he's staying in China. Now, the bigger players, Walmart, the biggest of the big, is in the process of diversifying away from very heavy reliance on China. Nobody's abandoning China, at least not most companies. China's going to continue to be at the center of global manufacturing. But there is certainly a sense that if you wake up in the middle of a pandemic and you discover that in the richest, most powerful country on earth, you're heavily dependent on a single country that, not incidentally, we're having a trade war with for things like basic materials, for medicines, for personal protective gear like face masks and medical gowns. That's a pretty sobering experience. And there's certainly a push to think about place in a way in which we haven't for decades.
Your book, let's just bust out the title again, How the World Ran Out of Everything Inside the Global Supply Chain. But everything came to fruition, came to a head, whatever the expression is, during the global pandemic. We all saw you go to the store and you can't get hand sanitizer, or we had a point where we ran out of baby formula, right, et cetera. And so now we're sitting here almost halfway through 2024. July 2nd is the halfway point of a non-leap year. So, it kind of gives you some perspective here. So we're almost halfway through 2024. And how much has actually changed from the start of that pandemic to now? That was one of the things I thought was interesting, is maybe, you talked about like all going lean and the just-in-time shipping and all this stuff about how they might change things. But ultimately, it seems like the supply chain, it's so complex and convoluted and intertwined. It's really hard to make any noticeable changes unless you are Walmart or Amazon.
Look, this thing's built for giant companies. It's built by and for giant companies, and they are the ones who can change it most easily. There's no question that there is some change. How long it lasts, the further removed we get from the pandemic, is an open question, because let's face it, publicly traded companies, they're managed by people who are answerable to Wall Street, and Wall Street wants immediate gains. It's about making your stock price go up in the short term. And if you're a corporate executive who's saying, oh, we ran out of stuff during the pandemic, and by the way, you probably, unless you've got massive competition, you probably ended up with much higher prices and higher earnings as a result of that. So, we should keep that in mind. But even the companies that were actually hurt by product shortages, if a corporate executive at a publicly traded company says, let's go spend more money to build another factory somewhere else, let's put more redundancy in the supply chain, let's fill up a warehouse with products as a kind of insurance policy against the next unforeseen trouble, somebody is essentially saying, let's spend more money and let's dilute the next quarter's earnings. Whereas the CEO who says, let's just go back to how we were doing it and rely heavily on one giant country that can build things very cheaply. And yeah, there'll be problems later on. Well, that'll probably happen on somebody else's watch. And by the time it happens, that CEO will end up on a beach in a hammock with a cocktail in their hands. And that those incentives are still in place, rewarding short-term cost cutting. Now, there have been some government changes. I mean, the Biden administration is talking heavily about antitrust enforcement, cracking down on monopolies. But the biggest monopoly of them all for our purposes is shipping. That's an international cartel. That's really beyond the purview of any single regulator. So there are certainly a lot of reasons to worry that when we inevitably have the next shock, and we don't know what it'll be, it could be another pandemic, could be a natural disaster, but something will happen because that's how life works. We will again discover that we are going too far with this kind of ruthless dedication to efficiency that turns out to not be all that efficient when you can't make a ventilator in the middle of a pandemic.
What do you think were the biggest changes that have been instituted or implemented since the pandemic ended? You mentioned this in your book, but you talk about the shortage of microchips and how Ford and some of these other companies couldn't even, finish cars. You'd have all these cars sitting in a parking lot, yet you can't turn them on because they don't have the chips.
Across the street from Henry Ford Elementary School is where they were depositing those cars. It was amazing. Henry Ford would have been spinning in his grave.
He would have been spinning. Yeah, I mean, we could talk about Henry Ford later. He was the king of vertical integration,
right,
as you mentioned. But basically, I think isn't the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, or TSMC,
TSMC,
which produces something like 92% of all the advanced microchips in the world. So now they have a plant that they're building in Arizona since this, but it seems like it's been delayed. It's cost more money. Aren't they up to like $65 billion now investment or something?
Yeah, I've lost track. I mean, it's more complicated than they bargained on. It's hard to find workers. Housing is really unaffordable in Phoenix. That's a problem in terms of getting people to stay there. Yeah, look, I mean, the most basic estimates of what it costs to build a computer chip plant are like $20 billion. Most people don't have that kind of money just sitting around. But I think it's worth noting that $20 billion is about what Intel spent buying back its shares in the three plus years before the pandemic. Why do you buy back your shares? Because it reduces the number of shares in circulation, makes share prices go up, does absolutely nothing for your operational efficiency. It doesn't help you, it doesn't make you better at doing the thing that you do as a company. It makes investors happy. And, back to Ford. Ford was actually very suspicious of financialization. I mean, he got sued by some of his early investors, the Dodge brothers, when he was trying to build the River Rouge factory, this giant monument to self-sufficiency on the Rouge River outside of Detroit. And the Dodge brothers said, well, we noticed you got $50 million on your balance sheet. How about you give some of that money to us in the form of dividends? And Ford said, no, I'm trying to build products efficiently and cheaply. I want to drop the price and make mass goods. And I got to think about the operations of my business, not just rewarding investors. And they did what every red-blooded American does in that situation. They fought a lawsuit. They won. He did manage to build the plant anyway. But I argue in the book that you can sort of draw a straight line from that decision to present day, because we're increasingly living in not just a supply chain, but a business world in general that's run by people who are answerable to the investor class above all. And turns out, breaking news, the social good isn't always maximized when we do that.
Do you think the building of this microchip fabrication plant in Arizona is one of the biggest things that's come out of?
Yeah, it's a pretty big deal. I mean, out of this regardless of how one feels about it, and it's a complicated subject, there's no question that because of the pandemic and these disruptions, the Biden administration has started to talk about the supply chain as a national security issue. I mean, that's a new thing, right? So there is now official government policy that says it's important that some things like computer chips be made in the United States, that we can't just entrust our supply to an island that's 90 miles off the coast of China, a country that happens to claim that island as part of its own territory. And that, again, not incidentally, we happen to be having a trade war with. That's not a good idea. It doesn't pass the common sense test. So the Biden administration is spending tens of billions of dollars in subsidies to get companies like TSMC and Intel to build chip plants in the U.S. They're also handing out subsidies to companies that are developing electric vehicles in the United States. Again, with the logic being that this goes beyond just normal goods, right? There's no reason to subsidize T-shirts and tube socks, right? If we don't buy them from China, we'll buy them from Vietnam or Pakistan or India or Guatemala, whatever. We don't have to worry about where those come from, but we do have to worry about an emerging industry like electric vehicles. We want to make sure that the U.S. has a hand in that. Again, that's the logic of it. There are reasons to challenge that logic, but that's definitely a new thing that's happening in Washington as a result in part of this pandemic.
Yeah, I've read the book Chip War. I believe it's by like Chris Miller. I think.
Yeah, it's a great book.
Right. Yeah, it's a great book. But basically, I think was it the first Gulf War where they had all these missiles with microchips in them that could really home in on a target. And basically, if you got into a war, whether it's Russia or China or India, whoever has the most microchips is probably going to, right? Like if you don't, I mean, especially nowadays with drones and all these, vehicles that are driving themselves and missiles that have GPS and other logistics that are programmed through the chip. Like if you don't have the chip, you're screwed. And then just like, I mentioned earlier, it's like the fact is, in America, we couldn't even build an iPhone. I saw an interview with Tim Cook was basically saying like, we don't even have enough tooling engineers to build the tools that you put onto the machine to actually build the actual AirPods or whatever. I figured like the AirPods have over 200 components to actually be able to pack in that audio quality in such a tiny space.
Sure.
I mean, you gotta.
But I guess I would challenge the idea that I think is pretty popular that like that's just a tragedy. Boy, we can't even build an iPhone in America. I mean, we designed the iPhone. We're getting most of the value out of the iPhone ecosystem. I mean, the mistake that we've made is that we've sent production to principally one country. We've allowed the iPhone to be made in places where there are all kinds of to worry about labor conditions that are potentially undercutting American labor conditions. We've gotten out from under environmental regulations, and we've put ourselves in a position where one shock happens, and we've now got this whole significant, pipeline of iPhones that's threatened, along with a lot of other things that we now depend on. But there's nothing wrong with trade, right? The problem is the way we've done trade. I mean, there are two primary problems. One is we've abandoned the people who've lost their jobs in the face of trade. And when you trade, some people are going to win, some people are going to lose. If you do it right, a lot more people are going to win through lower and better consumer goods, lower priced and better quality consumer goods, more choices. And then a handful of people are going to lose their jobs. And what we've really failed at is cushioning those people. And in other developed countries, there are training programs that are actually effective. We have them in the States, but they're really underfunded. They don't really do much for people. And so we don't have national health care. Education's super expensive. So if you lose a job in the United States, it's a pretty steep way down. And that's on us in terms of our own American policy. That's not a sort of made in China problem. So that's problem one. Problem two is we've really narrowly concentrated production in countries like China. So one shock then puts us in a position where we run out of stuff. And sorry, I'll add a third one. We've gone with just in time, which was a very sensible idea pioneered by Toyota. This idea that you don't just make lots and lots of stuff a la Ford in the dawn of mass assembly. You make what you need to replenish the products that you've already sold. You have your suppliers show up at your assembly line with the goods that you need, the materials that you need in real time. That takes waste out of the system. that was a sensible idea, but along come consultancies like McKinsey, and they turned it into this very crude imperative to just like slash inventory, don't put things in warehouses, take the money you're saving, give it to yourself, CEO, through executive compensation, give it to the shareholder through dividends. And that set us up for the shortages that we've had during the pandemic era, and really every time there's been a shock. So we don't want to throw trade out the window. I mean, we probably would never be able to make an iPhone without the specialization that we've got from moving production around. We just don't want to concentrate it all in one place.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about 50 different countries just to build an iPhone. It'd be pretty hard to ever bring that level of expertise into one nation regardless, right? It doesn't seem like you'd ever be able to.
Well, that's right. But moreover, you got to remember, there's a lot of factories in the United States where American workers are making stuff, and they're using the global supply chain to bring them components and materials. And oftentimes they're getting most of the value out of it, but we're depending upon a global supply chain. So if we cut off access to the global supply chain, if we chase this fantasy that we can make everything in the United States, that jeopardizes a lot of jobs that are here now.
Another point that you made that I thought was interesting was where you were talking about how they're like, okay, we'll set up shop in Vietnam, maybe get around some tariffs that are imposed on China, it's cheap labor or whatever. But then it's like the factories in Vietnam are then waiting on parts from China.
Right.
So it's like it really didn't actually make any difference, right? I mean,
it makes some difference, right? And it specifically makes difference in terms of tariffs. But if there's another pandemic that shuts down Chinese production, you're going to have goods shortages in Vietnam. And, who knows? A lot of those companies in Vietnam are subsidiaries of Chinese companies. Let's say Trump wins the election in November and decides to follow through with 60% across the board tariffs on Chinese imports. And then he decides to extend that to goods that are going into products from other countries. I mean, he could do that. That would affect Mexico. That would affect Vietnam. Both of those countries are drawing lots of components from Chinese factories. You start messing around with supply chains, things get complicated pretty quick.
You talked about the consultancy group in your book, and in particular about McKinsey. And I've read a book called, I think it's called When McKinsey Comes to Town.
My colleagues. Yeah. Mike Forsyth and Walt Bogdan. It's just a great book.
Right, which is, I recommend that book. But in that book, he says a person just out of college starting at McKinsey starts at $195,000 a year. Yeah, and just really, like right. I say that. And just like the conflicts of interest, they're advising the FDA while they're at the same time advising like Purdue Pharma, and they were advising companies, these pharmaceutical companies during the whole opioid crisis. And I think they ended up paying out like $600 million, which some people thought they got away fairly easy on that. And they advise the Pentagon, and then they advise China and Saudi Arabia and other countries with, authoritarian dictatorship regimes. And of course, McKinsey was one of the ones that was big into lean. You talk about that. Was it like the Taliban lean or whatever? But it seems like a lot of the consultancy groups really kind of take a lot of the blame that most people wouldn't really think about these consultancy groups, I guess, is what I'm getting at.
I mean, the consultants are working for the executive ranks, right? And their job is to come up with things that are make share prices go up quick. And so if you're running a factory or a transportation business and you're actually thinking about doing things sensibly, then the consultants can come in and propose things that seem absolutely crazy. I mean, I tell the story of this industrial generator company in Minnesota. And I talked to a guy named Jerome Bodner, who had been there for 20 years. He had a business degree from the University of Minnesota. And one day, the guys from McKinsey show up. It's a bunch of young people fresh out of Ivy League schools in slick suits, one older guy from the Chicago office. And they basically say, you guys are doing it all wrong. You need to slash inventory. Well, what's with all this inventory? And they're like, well, these are, $5 sheet metal brackets, and we need them so that we don't run out of them. No, you need to eliminate this kind of waste. Let's move this stuff out. And these guys are like, well, we're making industrial generators. Talk about just in time. I mean, our customers are hospitals. They have to be installed by crane. If we don't get this thing where it's going right on time, that's like a serious problem. The customer's not happy. no, you're this is how we're doing it, and don't talk back to us. These McKinsey guys were known, as you said, as the lean Taliban. They were hardcore, and you get reported up to your boss if you went against what they were advising. And so as a result of this factory was routinely missing delivery dates for these giant generators, having to shell out hundreds of thousands of dollars in emergency delivery charges in order to save, $5 on a sheet metal bracket. I mean, that's efficiency taking to extremes that are highly inefficient. And that is the nature of the problem that we're up against.
McKinsey is basically like a management consulting firm. They're not there for the workers, right? They're there for management. Thus, it's more of a management consulting firm, right?
They view workers generally as inventory themselves. They should be as lean and flexible as possible. You want to limit paychecks. You want to make sure that the company can get people to work when they need them. And a lot of this, undercuts morale, which is something that doesn't get talked about enough as something important. I mean, back to Henry Ford, who again was a very problematic character, but knew a thing or two about supply chains. I mean, he doubled wages at his factories in, I believe it was 1914 to $5. And some people in the business world said he was a communist. He said, I'm not a communist. I'm trying to make my products reliably. And I need people showing up to work who aren't just thinking about their financial problems at home or how they're fighting with their spouse because, they have no idea what they're going to get hours or how they're going to pay the bills. I just want reliability in my business. And I've come to understand that a low wage business is inherently unstable. And that is certainly a takeaway from my book.
What would you say is the most problematic part of the supply chain? I mean, you talked about a lot of different things. The container ships, you said, there's only three companies. I mean, you talked about
three alliances.
The three alliances. Right. Yeah. Three alliances. Right. You talked about the meat packing and was it like four big meat companies?
Four giant meat packers control 85% of the American market. The robber barons would blush.
Then the truckers, pretty much everything touches a truck. Even if it's on a train, you still have to move it from the train to the warehouse, etc. Right? So you talked about trucking. What do you think is the most problematic?
It's all connected. It's all connected. But I guess the one that we should fret about the most is shipping, because that's the one where even our own government has the least influence. And in fact, I spent time with Dan Maffei, who's a former congressman from upstate New York, who runs a body most people never heard of called the Federal Maritime Commission. But he was essentially tasked by the president himself with bringing the shipping companies to heel, because there were all these stories of, you might have a contract to move containers from China to the West Coast of the United States for $4,000 or $5,000 US, and they would say, oh, sorry, there's no space on the vessel. Oh, but if you pay all these special handling charges that take the price up to $20,000, well, suddenly there is space on the same vessel. And then exporters, I read about almond farmers who had an entire year's crop that was already sold. This is in California, source of 80% of the world's almonds. They'd sold their crop to buyers in Dubai and Japan, but they couldn't get shipping companies to bring the containers to them in the port of Oakland because they were making so much money moving containers full of factory goods from China to the West Coast of the United States that they were just bypassing Oakland. It was just like uninteresting to them. And so Dan Maffei is tasked with sorting this out through the Federal Maritime Commission. I had an interview with him where he told me, he said, well, I'm a little nervous about pushing the carriers too hard because, they're foreign companies and they don't have to serve the United States. Can you imagine that? Like you're like the mayor of LA, and some airline is telling everybody showing up there for their flights with confirmed tickets that there's no space for you unless you pay 10 times as much. And the mayor's, afraid to upset United Airlines because maybe they'll stop flying to Los Angeles, the second largest city in the world's largest economy. That's what we're dealing with. There's at least a feeling that we don't have levers to pull. I personally, I don't have to think that's true. This is still the world's largest economy. I do think we have some say over the conditions, but we're talking about a bunch of companies that don't strictly answer to Washington.
Yeah, I was reading the book, The Secret Life of Groceries. I don't know if you've read that book.
I've read about it. Yeah, I haven't picked it up.
But, you talked about the trucking Yeah, it's very interesting. I highly recommend the book. But he talks also about the trucking industry, and he rides along with this lady. I forget her name, but she's 6'2". I remember that part. But anyways, like you kind of mentioned about the owner operator. So then you go to like Swift or one of these big trucking companies, and then they basically are charging you a lot more to go to this training school than if you just paid it out of your pocket or went to an independent one like at a community college. And then you get sucked into this really expensive truck payment. And then if the truck breaks down, you got to bring it to certain repair shops where they're charging you 4 times the price, and you're signing these contracts. And she said that she grossed $200,000 and her net was, he said, around $17,000. And he's like, honestly, I think the $17,000, he said, he used the word proud. She's probably proud and even over exaggerated. Yeah.
It's a tough life. It's a tough life. It used to pay a hell of a lot more. This is why we ran out, air quotes, of truck drivers in the middle of the pandemic. We got 10 million people in the United States with commercial driver's licenses. It's 3 times as many as we actually need. But we keep running out of them because it just doesn't pay enough to justify being away from your family for weeks, sometimes months at a time, sitting at warehouses for hours and hours, not knowing when the warehouse people will load up your load, sometimes getting sent to the wrong places, getting stuck in these traffic jams at the ports. I mean, it's just kind of a hellish existence. And by the way, they spend much of their time just worrying about caffeinating enough to not fall asleep at the wheel, but not so much that they have to pull over and use the restroom because it's very difficult to park a truck, and there's fees involved in that. So unless we make this a more rewarding pursuit, we're going to keep running out of truck drivers because we're treating these people in a just-in-time economy like their time is kind of limitless, and the time they spend with their families has no value at all.
And 2024 right now, do you think if we had another pandemic or some type of similar event, doesn't have to be a pandemic, but something that would be similar in scale, would anything be different? Would you go to the store, not find any hand sanitizer, and ventilators are not being manufactured, etc.?
Well, look, there were unique circumstances to the pandemic, but every situation has its unique circumstances, right? We had this surge of factory-made goods because we had this colossal miscalculation by the companies within the supply chain where they assumed that we're all locked up in our houses, our kids aren't going to school, people are thrown out of work, that's less spending power. Therefore, there's going to be less demand for everything from cars to electronic goods to food. And so they slashed orders for things. And of course, the way it worked out was, okay, we're not going to the gym anymore, but we're still exercising. We're buying Peloton bikes and sticking them in our basements. Our kids aren't going to school, but now they're home. We have to cook them 27 meals a day. We need more kitchen appliances. We need to entertain them. We're buying trampolines and barbecues for our backyard because we can't go to amusement parks and restaurants. And a lot of this stuff is made in factories, much of it in China, and that overwhelmed the works, along with the hand sanitizer, the personal protective gear. So, we don't have these sorts of circumstances, but we're actually living a shock right now that people aren't generally talking about. The Houthis in Yemen are opening fire on vessels that are headed toward the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. This is a major it's a major shortcut, basically, from Asia to Europe and onto the east coast of the United States. The Houthis are doing this in solidarity with Palestinians in Gaza. The result of this is 90% of the container traffic that usually goes through the Suez Canal is instead going the long way around Africa. This is a journey that adds thousands of miles, millions of dollars in extra diesel, and not incidentally, a couple of weeks to the transit time. So there are delays. And guess what? Shipping prices are up. They're up 5-fold in the space of 6 months from Asia to Europe, and by a similar margin from Asia to the West Coast of the United States. There are already people worrying that we're going to have shortages of things come the holiday season. I talked to a bunch of retailers who were saying they're ordering extra and earlier now in anticipation of these continued shipping problems. And that could be kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. If everybody does that, then we will have a surge of product and we will have floating traffic jams and backups at warehouses and all of this, and we could get the product shortages. So no, I don't think we're any more prepared for a shock than we were before.
Maybe it's like the opening chapter, but where you talked about the containerization. But basically a trucker, I believe it was from North Carolina, was the one that
Malcolm McLean.
Right, Malcolm McLean was a trucker and figured out how you could take a container, then you could move it on a train, or you could move it on a boat, or you could move it on a truck, and then he ended up setting up a big port in New Jersey. Do you really think that was when globalization really, rooted in?
I think that was a pretty big deal. Before containerization, every loading and unloading of a big ship took days and days, and each one was like a custom job, its own little jigsaw puzzle. It's incredibly dangerous. Dock workers had to figure out, where am I putting this big barrel of chemicals? Oh, I got to fit in this side of beef here. We'll layer something on top. Now, with the container, these standard size boxes, you can load them at factories. You can move them around by crane, standard equipment. They fit on the back of a truck, they fit on trains, and they can be hoisted right onto the docks of ships. So it's much easier to move stuff around, and that certainly made it possible for companies to then take advantage of other things. The internet, China getting integrated into the global economy to then entrust their supply chains to factories on the other side of oceans.
And then you also mentioned about how you can really also automate. If you're talking about these cranes and these standardized containers, you can automate it. I think you mentioned about some European countries where didn't they essentially cut down their staff by like 96% just in the last
Rotterdam. Yeah, at individual terminals. Yeah, that's right.
And that's just going to continue in the future, I would imagine, with AI as they continue to improve that technology, right?
Robots don't get sick in pandemics or ever. They don't need restroom breaks. They don't complain about kids who are sick and have to be taken care of. And so, the same logic that drove production overseas, which is corporate executives looking to drop their costs, drives the embrace of automation. Not to make automation a bad thing. I mean, it depends upon the system in which it's implemented. I mean, in our own system in the States, there are reasons that, workers can legitimately fear this stuff because they know if they lose their jobs, again, they don't have health care, they don't have help. In other places, I've done some reporting in Sweden where I've talked to workers about self-driving trucks, at a big mine. And they said, oh yeah, we're for it. It makes the company more competitive. We'll get higher wages. If it costs us our job, we'll be trained for something else. And that's actually their lived experience. But technology is inevitable. Humans are innovative. We're going to figure out ways to lessen our physical burdens. But we got to look at who's in control of it and for whose interests.
You think we'll be seeing self-driving trucks in the U.S. making deliveries anytime soon, and kind of en masse?
I haven't looked into this enough to know. It certainly seems inevitable that these kinds of technologies will continue to get more and more advanced. But every industry has its own logic, its own regulations, and I'm not familiar enough with that question to know.
Peter, you wrote a book, I believe it was a couple of years ago, called Davos, Man, How the Billionaires Devoured the World. And I think I saw you in another either interview or podcast. Did you actually start writing how the world ran out of everything before the Davos Man, right? Did I hear that correctly? Right.
I did, yeah. I was living in London, had a newborn, born the first wave of the pandemic, moved my family back across the ocean to the States, was not looking for another book to write, but it was kind of thrust on me because the pandemic supply chain disruptions were just so bizarre. And suddenly people who had never given a thought to supply chains in their lives were, stopping me to ask me, what's going on? How come I can't find the cabinets I need? Why are cars, more than list price? And even used cars are the same price as new. What's going on with all this? And I just realized that this was, in fact, a hugely important story that sort of wrapped up a lot of my own career. Because, I was based in China right after China entered the WTO. I covered the dot-com bubble as a tech reporter at the Washington Post back in the 90s. I wrote about the Great Recession and the mortgage crisis in the States. And so there were just a lot of strands to this that I kind of had in my mental notebook, and I wanted to make sense of it.
Would you say that these two books, then the Davos Man and How the World Ran Out of Everything, are part of a similar thread, or are kind of part one, part two?
Yeah, in some ways. Davos Man is really about how the overlap, I say specifically that trade is not the problem. The problem is that a handful of people have monopolized the gains of trade. And I write about Bezos and the Amazon fortune in that context. And the problem is that wealthy people have dominated our form of very successful, rewarding capitalism in the US, and they've taken their wealth and they've purchased political power, and they've used their political power to tilt the rules further in their favor to make it easier for them to make a fortune, often at the expense of everybody else. And that played out specifically in the supply chain during the pandemic. In many cases, I mean, you look at meat packing, which is actually in both books, but in my most recent book, in How the World Ran Out of Everything, I tell the story of how these 4 companies that have an 85% share of the meatpacking industry in the United States got the Trump administration to actually deliver an executive order to keep slaughterhouses going in the worst of the first wave of the pandemic. And they got the Trump administration to actually parrot industry talking points that this was about making sure that we could feed people while they were actually sitting on, as I reveal in the book, record volumes of frozen meat that they were exporting around the world, including to China. So essentially, that's an example of the billionaire class managing to use its direct influence over the political process to sacrifice workers' lives in the interest of generating fatter monopoly profits while claiming to be doing something for all of us, feeding us.
I had Brody Mullins on the podcast recently. He's the author of the book, The Wolves of K Street, which is about lobbying. And he says that lobbyists are more powerful than the president or Congress. We talked about how there's basically only 12,000-ish registered lobbyists, but he says there's actually the numbers over 1 million because you only have to work in direct lobbying 20% of the time to be considered a lobbyist. And when you're talking about like this billionaire class, there's only 3,000 billionaires or so in the world, like with McKinsey and Boston Consulting Group, and there's some other big consulting groups that employ hundreds of thousands of people. There's 1 million lobbyists. And then in that same interview with Brody Mullins, he won a Pulitzer Prize at the Wall Street Journal for an article where he was investigating high-ranking government officials and politicians that own stock in companies that they regulate. And it turns out about 22% of them own stock in companies that they regulated. So between the lobbyists and the consulting groups, the billionaire class, the politicians that are owning stocks in companies that they regulate, there's just so many. I mean, there's millions of people. Like, people are going to do what's in their self-interest. Like I hear people like rip on Bezos or whoever. It's like, if you're in the same position, you'd probably do the same thing. You're just not a billionaire, so it's easy to act as if you're like so much better than Jeff Bezos or whoever. It could be Steve Jobs.
I don't demonize the billionaires. I mean, the point of that book is to say, let billionaires be billionaires, although we got to tax them and we got to make sure that they're not monopolies, so that there actually is a competitive marketplace so consumers and workers get a piece of the action as well. But we should get over this idea that their interests are our interests. I mean, the point of Davos, man, is to take aim at this idea that if we just keep deregulating and cutting taxes and get government out of the way, the good people like Jeff Bezos and Jamie Dimon and Mark Benioff and Larry Fink and Steve Schwarzman, they'll just solve our problems from climate change to whatever else it is that we care about. That's demonstrably ridiculous. We've been living that for now 50 years, and the results are in. What we get is more economic inequality. We get a lot of unhappy people who have concluded quite legitimately that the powers that be don't care very much about their families and their ability to pay their bills. And that's the source of the divisiveness and the kind of poisonous quality of our conversation at the political level. It's not that billionaires are bad. It's not that their creations are bad. I'm grateful for Amazon. I'm grateful for Google. It's that we can't step away from democracy. We still got to have a say over the conditions that shape the marketplace so that we can fund things that people actually care about: healthcare, public transportation, help for people who have a hard time. And that's just not compatible with surrendering all of our decision-making to the billionaire class.
I guess my point was, when I was bringing up these other people, is I think like it's, there's 3,000 billionaires, but there's hundreds of thousands of consultants where they're working on commission, or their remuneration is related to how much they're going to benefit the company. You have these 22% of government officials that are essentially regulating stocks that they own? Are they cracking down on these companies, or really?
No, that's a serious problem.
And then a million lobbyists, again, that are making, I'm sure they're all making six figures. So it's like you have millions of people. It just seems like the system is so like, where you're talking about these truck drivers making, $17,000 a year. And then you have the lobbyist in DC's blaming the billionaire. And then the lobbyist in DC's making $500,000 a year, screwing the trucker over and then blaming someone else when they're just as responsible. There's so many people.
The lobbyist in DC is blaming the billionaire. More often than not, the lobbyist in DC is blaming working people, right? I mean,
right.
We're talking right now about, one of the reasons why shipping prices are going up. We've got threatened dock worker strike on the Gulf Coast and on the East Coast of the U.S. We got threatened rail worker strike in Canada, which could be crippling for much of North America in terms of moving cargo. And, this is the move that these guys have to get a better deal for themselves, is to threaten us with instability in the supply chain. And, guess what? There are lots of statements from retailers, U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the president's got to step in and make sure that this doesn't happen because the rest of our livelihoods are on the line. That's true, but let's not overlook the fact that generally speaking, it's the working people who have not gotten the piece of the action out of the kind of globalization that we've had. I mean, we tend to blame the people who are most vulnerable and not the people who are actually the source of our problems.
You talk a lot in the book about kind of the monopoly power and how we've kind of surpassed the robber baron era. And when I had again, Brody Mullins on, the Pulitzer Prize winning author of that book I mentioned, he says he thinks in the next 20 years, one of the biggest issues that we will see in America is antitrust. And we'll be breaking up these monopolies. If we're way past the robber baron era, are we going to flip this around? Is the pendulum going to swing the other way? What do you see?
I mean, it's starting to happen already, right? So certainly the Biden administration has revived antitrust in a way that we haven't seen, going all the way back to Carter. That's significant, but I'm not the only person to notice that we're about to have a presidential election, and that could be changed quickly. So it's very hard to know, because our basic mechanism where you have a problem and then the source of the problem is somehow addressed through public unhappiness, that seems to have broken down. What we have is a lot of people who are unhappy for all sorts of legitimate reasons. And then we have a great disconnect between that and policy prescriptions. So again, like, we've got a lot of blaming of the supply chain. We've got a lot of blaming of China for problems that are largely made in the United States. The monopoly power is a huge problem, something that's got to be addressed through antitrust enforcement. It's happening now, but who knows how long that sticks.
You talked about Henry Ford in your book and how he had vertical integration, which basically means like he owned the mining companies to turn iron ore into steel. He owned like plantations where he had rubber trees. I think didn't he like go into the Amazon and have like the Fortlandia? It was a fiasco, right? Do you think that like we will see any more vertical integration?
No, I think it's more about specialization now. And I think that's fine. But I use Ford to put the focus on the fact that Ford never wanted to be in a position where his own production could be threatened by something that a supplier did. And you don't need to be vertically integrated to think about that.
Toyota then comes along and just does the complete opposite, right? that Ford did.
Right. Yeah. But they also didn't entrust their supplies to long supply chains. I mean, their suppliers were all clustered close to the original Ford factories around Nagoya, Japan. They weren't waiting around for ships to show up from thousands of miles away to replenish the stocks.
Peter S. Goodman, the author of the new book, How the World Ran Out of Everything Inside the Global Supply Chain, has joined us today. I just got two final questions for you, Peter.
Sure.
One, just where can people get a hold of you, find your book and the Davos Man book? And then secondly, leave us with a final thought.
Sure, you bet. My website is petersgoodman.com. Or you can find me at my New York Times author page or on Twitter. I'm still calling it that, Peter S. Goodman. LinkedIn, also Peter S. Goodman. One final thought. I hope if you read my book, you will never see a package at your door the same again. You give a thought to the army of people who are kind of invited not to think about, whose labor is going to making all the things that are in our homes and offices and bringing those things to our doors as well.
My dear friends, that is it for this episode of El Podcast. Once again, if you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe on YouTube as well as Rumble. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from. We thank you all from the bottom of our hearts for watching and listening, and we will see you on the next episode.